Item is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Any public comment? Nobody has approached me. I see a lot of bodies, but they're all associated with agenda items. We thank you for being here. Now we'll move on to the approval of the August 22nd minutes. What are your wishes? There's moved by Supervisor Lemmer. Is there a second? Seconded by Chair Gibbs. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. We'll move on to operational functions, discussion and possible action on claim disallowance. Mueller. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your packet is a claim disallowance letter from our insurer, WMIC. WMIC is recommending denial of this claim that was presented by Cheryl Mueller. My understanding of the claim and the recommended disallowance is certainly the allegations in the email claim were reviewed and not substantiated. So WMIC determined that the county does not have any liability for the unsubstantiated claims.
Okay. Any questions of Mike? If not, what are your wishes? What are your wishes? Chair Gibbs?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to deny the claim consistent with our insurance carrier's recommendation.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion to deny the claim will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Next, we'll move on to the approval of the July and August claims and question costs. And I think we just received the Excel version, and Christie's available. Christie, you were looking for feedback too. If I could just interject, I think there's a lot, it's a long list, but do we need all of the columns? Do we need the payment category, company, and status, and type of payment in there? Or, because I think most of them are pretty much the same, and that would shorten it and allow for easier review if we get rid of those 4 columns.
Yeah, and we also have a check register that we're working on, and it has even more columns, so we're still refining it. But until we get the better check register, we can eliminate some of those from the fine payments report that you receive now.
So it would be the first 4 columns, payment category, company, status, because company's always Marathon County, status is generally complete. It's ad hoc or one other, and then column A is similar to column E, and payment type.
I think you're looking at the Excel spreadsheet, and that one I didn't send to everyone. They have the PDF file, but I can definitely remove those before I would send that out as well.
Just in generating the report. Then it gives us the ability to scroll down without having to move back and forth all the time. I don't know what other members think. Supervisor Lemmer?
When I received the Excel, which is what I would prefer, so I would love to have that just going forward automatically, if that's okay. I hid columns B through E, and several others. I actually hid H through K. Run the alphabet through my mind, because some of those I don't need, but the ones that I would really like would be the maybe the company, the transaction date. I liked the payment memo. That helped me understand where some of these were going if it had a memo in it. The transaction reference I thought was important, obviously the payment amount. And then the cost centers were helpful. I left open reconciliation status. I'm not sure I really understand what that means, but there were a couple of payments that said reconciled or unreconciled, so.
Those are actually, I left them on there. Reconciled means that the check has been cashed, and unreconciled means that, particularly on checks, that it has not been cashed. Because sometimes we'll have people that move or change addresses, or they say they don't get their check. So just kind of shows you the timing of how fast people are cashing checks as they receive them. So I can keep that on there or remove it depending on how busy the report looks.
So if I could just, I think it's line 653 and 654. It's two of the same to Runkle abstract for $774,000, whatever. One says reconciled and one says not. And then one has, well, I hid the column, so I don't know what it was. A reference and one didn't. So I'm assuming those aren't two separate payments, and I'm assuming that was when we bought property for, anyway, that's why I left the reconciled and unreconciled, because I didn't know why those two were posted on separate lines, but anyway.
Let me I'm on the spreadsheet. I only have one screen, so I'm trying to take a look. It's probably two checks. One was for the purchaser and one was for the title company to pay for ancillary charges. But I can take a little bit better look when I'm back in the office.
And is that in July?
I know 8/14 maybe. Hold on, I'm trying to scroll to it. It's a long document.
Yes. I have to tell you that we have so many people that do a good job of paying bills, so we have quite a bit of activity each month.
I don't know. I have to do a search for Runkle. Okay. 8/15 is the date of it. And then one says no reference. The other one does have a check number. So it looks like it's the exact same amount as well.
If you could speak in.
Oh, sorry. It's actually 735 and 736 on my spreadsheet. It's dated 8/15 to Runkle Abstract and Title. It's the exact same amount, but one has a transaction number and one says no reference. So I'm just not sure.
Right. So if you take a look at column D, which shows that, so that first one was canceled.
Oh.
So we
Okay.
that one was canceled. The invoice was canceled prior to the check being issued. That I believe is column D on your spreadsheet. So that's why there is no reference to it. And then it was redone as the appropriate invoice and a check was issued. And that check number was 1008814, which was again cashed at that time. So just shows them up a little differently, but that's why column D is important. It shows that we entered a payment to them that was canceled and then reissued and was actually issued on that check, which was the next transaction line.
I guess I shouldn't have hit that column then, huh?
Well, that's why it's kind of fun, huh? You don't know when a column is actually needed until all the activities go on for the whole month. You see my dilemma, but we're working on it definitely. So questions are great.
Any other questions or comments relative to format? So I think what I heard is that columns A, B, C, could be removed. Any other thoughts?
This is Supervisor Marshall. I have a question on timing. Is it possible to get this more than 24 hours beforehand? Because it really is not enough time to review and ask relevant questions.
Yes, Supervisor Marshall, I apologize. We are trying to get a check register. Actually, you're getting what we call fine payments, which we then create to make the check register. We did have a check register that we're working on, and that's what we were trying to get out to you for the August report. It just is still too busy for that, and that's why we just went back to the old report that we're using. So we want to get out a report that's meaningful without being too busy and not giving you enough information, and that we're hoping would be the amended check register that we're creating. But again, that one's too busy. So either way, we will get you the September one much more timely, and it may still be this report you're seeing, not the actual check register that we're working on, but we will get it out to you sooner.
If it could come with the agenda, that would be great.
We don't want to, yes, but we would send that out earlier via email because we don't particularly want to have all of our suppliers and the amounts that we pay them listed out on the public website. But we would
Just for
get that
timing.
out
I'm just talking
within-
timing. At the same time would be like the Friday afternoon would be great.
I will try to make sure we get that out within 1 to 2 business days after the close of the month so we can get that to you and have time for you to review it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, what are your wishes to do relative to the July and August claims and question costs? Chair Gibbs,
I'll make a motion to approve.
is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all is in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, we're going to move on to 7A. It's the Mike Show again. Mike and other show.
Yay. Okay. So in speaking with Chair Robinson prior to today's meeting, he asked about an update regarding since we did the transition to in-rem, how are we doing with tax deed properties? What is the status? So I've been meeting with Connie and Steve and her team pretty regularly on moving these properties through. I can tell you, as far as the in-rem process, the first batch of 30 or so properties, all the notices have been sent out. We're in the waiting period where we have to statutorily wait until we can file the actual court action. Once that deadline is hit, we'll be ready to file those. There is also a second batch that has been initiated by the Treasurer's Office, and they're going through sending the notices out on that second batch of properties. So I think we're making good progress. It is a bit of a learning process because this is the first time we've done this in-rem process. So we've been identifying some things that we can change, tweak, and improve for the future. Once we're in a position where we're caught up, this is going to be a much better process. Right now, if we took all of the properties at once and listed them, there would be so many that we would make a mistake, honestly. So that's why we're dividing them into pieces so that we can get them to flow through the court system. As far as the properties that have already been taken by tax deed.
Can I stop there?
Please.
In the context of the NREM process, so can you walk us through that process again? So we've got the notice and the waiting period, and then once the waiting period is done, we've got the
Yep.
filing.
Yep. So these are properties that are at least 2 years, have at least 2 years of delinquent property taxes. There's been a tax certificate issued. We've started from the oldest properties on the list of properties, and we're trying to catch up and make that list go away. But started at the oldest ones. The Treasurer's Office, with my assistants, we put together a letter that we provide to each property owner indicating, well, first, Runkle Title and Abstract has been assisting us with title research on these properties to make sure we have as up-to-date information as we can on the owner, anyone else who has interest in the property. Then we provide them notice of our intention to go through the in-rem process through this letter that we've developed, gives them their payoff amount. The letter itself goes out, it triggers a statutory 90-day waiting period where we have to wait to see if anyone's going to take their last shot at redeeming the property. Once that waiting period is done, my office takes the lead on filing an in-rem foreclosure case with the courts. That's basically a case filing that groups all of the properties into one case. After that filing, the various owners have 30 days to respond to the in-rem filing. If they don't respond, the court will have a hearing a little bit after that 30-day period to enter a default judgment and transfer ownership of the property to the county. If they do respond, they have a very limited number of defenses that they can raise. I don't anticipate we're going to get a lot of those because they're very specific to, you know, that the tax is not right or something like that. I don't really anticipate that will happen, but it could happen. They could retain counsel and then we'd go through litigation. But for the majority of the properties, after that 30-day period in which they have to answer, we can get back into court and have a judgment entered transferring the property ownership over.
Can I just ask Connie then, since we issued the original 30 notices, how many have come in and settled?
We have 2 that actually came in and paid in full out of the 37 properties. And then the list of the second round of list of 177, we've had 11 people come in and pay in full. We have not issued letters to them yet, but they know that we're coming after them for their properties. And the amount that we received on those 11 properties was around $143,000. That included the refunding of the Runkle payment, so they paid all the interest, all the penalties, and we have not issued anything, so we have not taken those properties, so they paid everything. So like I said, within the last couple of months, we received almost $143,000. And off the 50, that first 50 list, 3 have paid in full. And we have not taken their property, so. Plus a lot of other properties are surfacing that are further down the list, and we're looking into them because they're very unique.
Kurt?
So Connie, what do we have as far as a total list on our current, whatever list we want to call it, the delinquent for more than 2 years property tax properties?
We kind of looked at what we have right now from what we started. We're going to be going like to 193 properties we're going to be giving to Runkle in the first of the year. But out of that, I think it's like 340, I think, somewhere around there. But there's like at least 12 or 13 of them the county doesn't want to take. Then we got another 30, 40 that are those slivers. We're working with CPZ on those slivers right now so we can get rid of them. But we are getting a lot of conversations with owners. They're trying to figure out ways to relinquish their, they don't want it or they have to figure out a way to keep it. We've also had a couple of them that CPZ was involved in with the health department. We can take their property, but we still have to notify them 90 days, but they were evicted off the property for a while. And I'm still working on the Weisenberger property with City of Marathon. So, and there was another one that surfaced. It was on Kickbush Street. It's an historical house. And I was notified by the owners that they don't want it. It burned in 2021, but nothing happened with the house. So I'm working with Dana in the City of Wausau on that property as well. If anyone, because it's an historical building, so the houses are surfacing, so we're working on each one as they come in.
All right, so if you want to then go with what happens once we get them.
I would love to. So if you'll recall, you made some updates to your ordinance 3.20 very recently. Under that ordinance, the idea was let's give the county clerk a tool to utilize other than listing on our website, which is a surplus auction of some type. So the county clerk, under our ordinance, still has the power and authority to manage and sell all tax delinquent lands that are acquired by us. The clerk is also allowed to retain a surplus property auction services. In speaking with Kim earlier today, they have a lot of information they need up front to list those properties. So she's working on that short list of properties that we have right now that we need to list. As we talked about in that ordinance, we then go through the public sale process through the auction site. The minimum bid is set by your ordinance, and then hopefully the bidding goes on between folks in the public. Once the lands are sold, our ordinance requires us to recoup our unpaid taxes, assessments, and then any excess funds have to go to the former owner. So there has to be an interface then between the clerk's office and the treasurer's office to ensure that the excess funds can be identified to the treasurer, and so that Connie can cut the check. So that's a process that is newer and that we're working through.
And so the process of listing it with the surplus property, so could I just walk through a hypothetical? So we take this next round through the MREN process. Internally, we see if any county departments have an interest in it. Do we reach out to the municipality and then we put it on the surplus site? How do we, do we have a time frame for that?
I'll look to Kim because she's the one who actually has started
I
to work on
just
this.
got all the process from Wisconsin Surplus. They have about a 3-page form that needs to be filled out for each property. And they want pictures, they want all kinds of information on the property. So it's kind of a putsy process because I have to give them all the information and then they actually list it on the site. So once I get them the information, they've told me it'll be about a 1-week turnaround time to get the properties actually up and running on the site.
Can we charge for those services?
That is our plan. Charge back to the
All right, Kurt?
Just one thing that I don't know that has been resolved yet, and that is if we have a property that we've taken that a municipality wishes to acquire, how do we determine fair market value so that we don't get, because as we heard on the WCA call this last Monday, some counties have taken properties and forwarded the excess proceeds to the former owner, but we're also starting to get requests for previous properties, or not Marathon County, but other counties have been starting to receive requests for proceeds that exceeded the debt that the county may have had on that property. And so I want to prevent us getting into a situation where we provide it to a municipality at exclusively our cost. How do we plan to protect ourselves and say that was fair market value?
That's a great question, Mr. Chair. No, I think we had that conversation initially when we were talking about the ordinance updates themselves, and I think that issue of fair market value is going to be one that's litigated in the courts. I'm hoping that we're not the ones who are involved in the litigation, but I think before any transaction with a municipality occurs, we just have to do our due diligence with the involvement of this committee to make sure we're setting a fair market value that we all can justify in court. So it has to have some thought go into it, and I think when we get to that situation, we'll have to walk through it very carefully.
Yeah, that was my only point, is I think we need to be deliberate in our process of how we document fair market value at the time. Thank you.
All right, any other questions relative to the process? I thought it just important, you know, we don't always do that, get that follow-up. I thought it just important, given the amount of time we spent on this, to get that update. And so in the process of the acquiring of the property through NREM, tax deed, or whatever process, Connie is the lead. Sort of in that procedural process, Mike and the Corporation Council is in control. And then once taken, the responsibility shifts to the clerk. So you've got the treasurer, corp counsel, clerk, involved in that process.
I too just wanted to mention, we're working very close with Mike. If we see or hear of any properties that are of question, we will be bringing them to the committee. So just so you know that, I mean, we look at every single one of these properties very closely and make sure that we follow everything before we take it. And then follow everything to make sure we're following Act 216. We do have some of the people calling us asking for their proceeds, but we just, we don't really tell them anything until we actually know what's really happening. We just tell them that we will get back to them. So, but I'm just letting you know that if there is something of concern, we will be bringing it to your attention. The DNR has issued a couple condemned properties to us. We haven't got to them yet. So once that point happens, we will be bringing those to you. So just wanted you to know that.
Thank you all for your efforts, and hopefully we can reduce that backlog and get the properties back in the tax roll. So, good progress. All right, budget update. Lance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to give you a brief update, bottom line up front, the next 2 weeks are going to be exceedingly busy for administration, finance, and departments. But where we are right now, department heads are really doing an exceptional job. Christy was talking before about our work with the check register and how we're trying to refine that. Take that process and how we're kind of learning our way through it and multiply that by, I don't know, an order of magnitude of 10 or 100 perhaps, and that's our budget process. The new software system, certainly I think everyone can see the long-term benefit, but make no mistake, this first year is quite the challenge as we navigate through that, but I wanted to give credit to department heads and how they're approaching that and working with finance and administration. So what can I share to this point? We probably have about, I would say we're more than 2/3 of the way through with our meetings with departments. And department heads are delivering on, quite honestly, the requests I made through my budget memo, which was driven by the information you provided through your budget assumptions as well as your budget guidelines and priorities. So just to recap some of those, there's no new positions funded in this budget. In fact, we have a number of departments who, following through your other budget priority of trying to limit operating expenses by being as efficient as possible, we have a number of allocated positions that remain full-time allocated approved positions through the county board that are not going to be filled and funded through the budget. I'll write about that in my budget message about, I think, an opportunity for us to create a kind of a hybrid position across a number of those departments. You'll recall in last year's budget, we had that approach with Corporation Counsel's office. We had an allocated position that, based on efficiencies and all the great work of Mike and Jamie and the rest of the team in that office, that we move forward not funding that. So that's continuing. The other budget priorities that I'll just highlight, again, no new positions, but employee compensation and benefits. This committee is well acquainted with the assumptions and guidelines that were put through in the budget process. We're following those. So the last thing I'll talk about relative to guidelines really relates to fees. And you have a couple of documents that I think are good examples of the work that a number of departments have put forward, and that is Parks, Rec, and Forestry, as well as solid waste and conservation planning and zoning. This is in connection with their work through the the Environmental Resources Committee. And all of our departments were really tasked through my memo to look at those fees, look at the budget assumption that the board adopted of increased fee revenue of 1.5% through the budget process. And let's evaluate what opportunities. So I'm not going to go into detail as to what opportunities were identified, but you'll see those documents from the departments that I referenced. The other one I'll just reference, if you were a member of the Health and Human Services Committee, the Board of Health did a really nice job reviewing with the Health Department their fee structure to kind of identify some challenges within that fee schedule. It hadn't been looked at, portions of it hadn't been looked at in a while, and there were some elements of inequity or certainly complexity, and I think they've done a nice job to address those. So that has really been a significant portion of the work that department heads have done. The other thing that I wanted to highlight that you'll see me make reference to in the budget is we've really tried to do something that historically we haven't done before across all of our departments, and that is really better understand and allocate our overhead costs to departments that fit into a couple of key categories. It's not, allocating overhead isn't all that important for departments that are funded strictly through tax levy and solely through tax levy. That's not all that important. But for these three categories that I'm going to talk about, I think there was an opportunity that this committee over the last several sessions of the board has brought this up. And it's really consistent with how we are now supposed to approach any future joint ventures that we would enter into relative to allocating overhead. But we really tried to make some strides this year in the budget. And credit to Christy and her team and working with IT and our other departments to do this. But multi-jurisdictional departments is one. You know, by virtue of kind of the approach we've taken, the forethought of the board, we're a member of a number of these multi-jurisdictional departments. Central Wisconsin Airport, the Aging Disability Resource Center, Parks, Rec, and Forestry that I referenced before. All of them have those elements of multi-jurisdictional service. And oftentimes I'll use Central Wisconsin Airport, certainly the ADRC as well, and Park, Rec, and Forestry. They all, by virtue of the county's size, we're oftentimes the one that people look to for things like legal assistance, using our HR system, finance assistance, facilities. So we want to make sure that we're appropriately allocating those costs so that essentially Marathon County taxpayers aren't, for lack of a better term, subsidizing some other jurisdiction. I think we've made some real strides in doing that in this year's budget. Another category of departments that we're putting into this kind of approach are those departments that have their own strict reserve. You know, unlike all the other departments that we've talked about before, where if they don't utilize all of their allocation through the budget, it reverts back into the general fund for purposes of CIP funding in the year following the audit. We wanted to make sure we approached it in a way that, well, if they do operate outside of that process, we're allocating overhead appropriately. And really, the library is the only one that is different in that respect, other than the multi-jurisdictional departments that I referenced before. And again, we developed a policy a couple of years ago to set a target for that fund. The library director has done a great job of really utilizing that reserve for things that they need to do, and I'll talk about that in the budget message. You know, a simple example is they're moving a library branch. One of the municipalities in which we have a library, Athens, is moving their branch. Well, there are incidental costs that are going to be incurred by the library as part of that, and they're funding those things, computer replacements, you know, all of the very non-sexy things we do in government that need to be funded. And then the last category that I wanted to talk about are really those grant-funded or enterprise-funded departments. So social services, again, Parks, Rec, and Forestry, and solid waste kind of fit into that conceptual bucket. And just to talk about solid waste, that's been a long-standing discussion, I know, at this committee. Chair Robinson has brought that up a number of times over the last several terms of the board, I think from probably my first days in administration, about, are we allocating all of these support services to our enterprise departments, and using the example of Lincoln County allocating or making a contribution of, I believe annually they put in $200,000 into the general fund as kind of a goal for us to work towards. So that's been one of the things we've talked about. So you'll see that in the budget in terms of the message that I'll deliver. But one of the biggest changes that I hope to offer, and Chris is going to start this conversation with your next item, trying to follow through on the board's directive to offer more opportunities for board involvement in the budget building process. You've certainly had those opportunities. All of the standing committees have had those opportunities to this point with their various meetings relative to nonprofits, for example, or our programs. We want to offer through the budget that I'm going to present to this committee and the full board more opportunities. So one of the things you're going to see is the capital project list that Chris is going to talk about. Chris really did a great job of really trying to strip that back. And we're going to identify those projects that from the staff perspective, hey, it makes strong sense from our perspective for these to move forward. And then we're going to take out as much other stuff as we can, and essentially what that's going to offer you is some retained funds through the CIP and ARPA funds that we're asking you to, and the full board really, to figure out what investments you want to make with those funds. I've used that word in the past. Really, we need to look at our capital dollars as investments. Where and how are we making investments with those funds? So we're going to offer that opportunity for you. We're also going to have a specific opportunity for you to consider how to use some funding that we've identified. There was a question from a supervisor about growth in our reserve fund, or specifically our social improvement reserve, and that has grown substantially over the last approximately 5 years. So we're doing some examination as to why that is, and Christy and our social services finance manager will make a presentation. We'll present that information to you, but the best explanation we have now is those funds are, a portion of them will be available for rollover into capital improvements under your current policy. Your current policy would be that those excess funds would roll into the capital improvement fund in 2025. That said, we'll present you a couple of options as to what to do with those funds should you choose to do anything this year. That's one option. We could modify the policy. You could modify the policy to take some action. We will talk briefly in a brief moment about rolling stock. That too is an option for some of those funds because of course, this committee is very familiar with the fact that our rolling stock allocation has not kept pace with inflation. It's probably the easiest average calculation you've ever needed to do in terms of a policy. Our rolling stock policy is set to be the average of the last 5 years. Well, it hasn't changed in 10. So that average calculation is pretty easy. And then the last thought off the top of my head that I'm going to write into the budget in terms of what you could do with those funds, and I brought this up at this committee before, is look at creating a large capital project and debt service fund. I know that the board has really taken a good hard look at our debt that we've incurred to this point, what we have in terms of outstanding liabilities. I did a little bit of asking around relative to my colleagues. There's not many counties that I've found that have this, but I know one does. And, I think it's an opportunity for the board to consider. It makes logical sense to me. Our CIP policy does a pretty good job of funding kind of those recurring things, the small and medium-sized projects. But it's really not a source of funding for a relocation of a highway department, or a $20 million recreation facility, or, as you know, all the work we've done down at North Central Healthcare. It's not a good funding source. It's not viable. It's not built for that. We could utilize some of these funds as kind of the starting place for that large capital project fund and debt service fund to essentially soften the on-ramp to debt service, because debt service is the viable funding source for large projects. That's how other counties fund. St. Croix County, for example, built a $80 million government center. That's not being funded with tax levy. That's being funded through debt service and debt levy. But you don't want to go from $1 million of annual debt levy to a $4 million payment. Your tax rate, that's a big fluctuation. So could we use those funds to essentially mitigate that on-ramp, make that more of a smooth process to transition that debt service to debt levy? I think that's an option. But again, those are policy questions for the board. So that's kind of my wrap up is you're going to see these opportunities. You're going to get a budget that will be complete. I mean, you could adopt it and not make any changes, and government will function perfectly well. However, I think you will have the opportunity through the way that we're presenting this to be more hands-on with some pretty important policy decisions. Another great example that's just occurred to me is the opioid settlement funds. The board previously directed the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council to look at those funds, the settlement funds, the 18-year stream that we're going to get essentially of those funds, and develop some recommendations. The CJCC will be hopefully finalizing that work later this week. I believe it's next week. One of the two. Sorry, off the top of my head, I don't know which one it is, but it's soon. They'll be finalizing their recommendations. My budget won't allocate a single nickel of those settlement funds. That's, again, something that the full board will have as an opportunity. Really, all these things how I'm trying to frame them, these are all opportunities for you to consider as part of the budget process. Not all of the decisions need to be made this year, of course, but I think the new process has served us well, at least from my perspective. It served administration well, it served me well, because it's moving to a strategy where we present those questions for the board to decide, as opposed to administration really showing up with a lot of those decisions made. So that was a long update. I think heavy on concepts, perhaps light on details, but happy to take any questions anyone might have.
So, Lance, I'll put you on the spot a little bit based on our discussion this morning. I think that there are still some struggles with integration of the new Workday and other things into developing the budget. And we had talked this morning about when that document might be ready, and our target was to present it to this committee and the county board at our 26th meeting. Is that, will we be in a position where we'll have the budget itself? The only reason I'm raising it is that I think that many members would like to have the document in front of them when we start that discussion. And, should we be prepared to potentially delay that until such time as we've got the document prepared? Understanding you're doing everything within your power to do it, I would just want to keep that open as an option, because I think, again, it would be more beneficial to the county board and this committee to actually have the document in hand and have it for a couple of days before. So any thoughts?
You've accurately summed up this current state of things. We're doing, I think, from the administration side and finance side, we're going to do everything we can to have that document in front of you on the 26th. I will be very transparent with you. It's going to be a challenge, but we're going to do everything we can. If the situation changes where I am convinced that we're not going to be able to have that completed and to you while we're discussing it, I will certainly reach out to you, Mr. Chair, and let you know, and also Chair Gibbs. But that's the goal.
And I would liken this to, the governor had requested additional time to submit his budget in the legislature concurred. And again, I think to have a meaningful discussion with the board, it's important to have that document. So I think we will evaluate where we are next Thursday at the county board meeting and potentially modify the delivery date based upon that. And it may call for a special meeting of the county board. And Kurt, you and I haven't had a chance to talk, but I think that would be preferable to, not having the document in front of the members. And I raised that early as a possibility.
And I think that's a very sound strategy. You will certainly, regardless of whether we have it completed at the end of September or shortly thereafter, you'll have a lot more time than you've had since I've been in administration. You'll have more time to chew on some of these issues, and I hope it is a more deliberative and meaningful process on the board member side, based on the feedback that we've gotten over the last several years to kind of offer these opportunities for the board to have more of its fingertips or leave its fingerprints, I should say, on the budget. But I'll let you know, Mr. Chair and Chair Gibbs, if it's not looking like we can get that completed. But we're doing everything we can to try to do that.
Chair Gibbs.
I'd just like to offer, I want to temper expectations. The challenges that Workday has created and continue to allow us to explore additional opportunities has put an exceptional amount of challenge on the administration to meet the timelines that we targeted. If we hadn't been in the middle of Workday implementation, I think it would have been a much more seamless process. But I want to temper expectations that it is not the fault of lack of effort if that does not happen on the 26th.
Are there any questions relative to where we are with the budget process? And any questions relative from other members? Okay. Thank you for that update. Next, we'll move on to the capital improvement program projects and rolling stock update. And again, it's an educational item, and we probably will need to take action at some point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will preface everything by just saying that coming into CIP, we learned that the CIP rollover was just over 2 million, was actually closer to 2.9 million once you count for CCIT's 30% of the rollover amount. But it was, compared to other years, it was a smaller amount. So then looking at the conversations that we've had at the committee and board level through the CIP presentation, it made sense to come back to the list and then see where could we dig into it and figure out where we could try to cut things out or kind of really boil some projects down to something a little more simple and straightforward, or find an alternative way to get something similar done to bring costs down, but also to put you and the board in a position of not necessarily having to choose what to take out, but to say, here are the things that we think clearly are the should-dos, and then present the opportunity with additional funding left over from the CIP fund balance and the ARPA fund balance, knowing that there's other ideas out there for utilizing one or the other in terms of the overall budget funds available, and put you in a position of saying, okay, what can we add to something rather than take away. So that was the intention. I'll walk you through some of the changes we made. A lot of it's the same. I modified the chart you saw previously. So on the left, you'll see there's a not funded column. So the projects that didn't receive funding in this current working draft, are still there so that people know that they exist, and if you wanted to fund them, what the amounts were, et cetera. Then you have the CIP fund balance. That's the traditional fund balance that we use with the rollover. A tax levy column, which is a simple one because it's just highways bituminous. And then I added an ARPA funding, which used to be a grant funding piece, but ARPA funding so that the projects funded through there, again, this is being presented to you for consideration, would be clearly identified as being ARPA funded, and there's one unique wrinkle in there that I'll get into in a second. Similar to tax levy, the reserve funding column only has one line item in it. That's a highway project out of highway reserve. And then there's the registration fees, which is an annual thing for highway projects. And then the other funding is wrapped up in state or federal share funding or unique funding allocations for the Forensic Science Center. So I should also note that just because something's in a not funded column doesn't mean that I will own this myself. You can blame me for it all, but it doesn't mean that I'm trying to make a judgment call per se. It's just trying to figure out if you really had to get this down to something more bare bones, what would that look like to me? So I think the lease discussions for the emergency management, if we can come in at a point where there's a situation to come in and get them a vehicle at a lower cost and incorporate that into a fleet arrangement like we have in facilities and CPZ, then we can look at that and remove the $70,000 straight up hit for a new vehicle. Similarly, there's discussions around delivery service and new vehicles for medical examiner. Currently, I've put those over into the ARPA funding. That could be maneuvered around, but essentially, these vehicles would replace their current vans, which are at varying levels of age. One of them is quite bad, but also includes a refrigerated van, which would be part of the livery service operations for the new Forensic Science Center should it move forward. I left the CPZ and FCM, our facilities fleet, as just the annual, very straightforward there. And then this is the wrinkle that I'll come back to, but it's because rolling stock is still up for discussion, and Captain Weber, Jamie, and Jim are all here to discuss their department's perspectives on the rolling stock as we look into that policy and how we can tackle this particular issue. Another change here is, let me scroll over here for a second. The 1100 Lakeview Drive, so this is the A and B project where we're contemplating moving county departments down to the Lakeview campus. So this is the largest big ticket item on the list. And looking at, the business case or looking at, ways that we could try to make this more palatable and fit the available funding, Troy, who's here today to help answer questions if you have any, did an excellent job of kind of whittling this down to remove $1.1 million from the project. The lion's share of that is wrapped up in an IT upgrade. The IT there works. It's not old per se, but it's not necessarily the latest. So that would be an area that normally you would upgrade along with other pieces of the building because you're opening up the ceilings and doing all those things at the same time. But that's certainly something we can do in a future year. So that was an easy thing to take off. And then in summary, for the balance was just looking at other aspects of the project that we could simplify, or just rather than building out into something that was going to try to add a storage space here or there, just make it more of a gray box. It would still serve a similar purpose, but not necessarily drive the cost up any higher than it needed be. It still provides funding for the renovation and upgrades, minimum to get the county departments moved over there, should we do this. It also allows for the funding that, from a facilities perspective, needs to be allocated regardless on this project because it dovetails with the other work that's happening in that space from the HVAC perspective, which would be, dropping the ceilings, tying into sprinklers for fire suppression and alarms, things like this that are really separate projects the way we've done it over the years in terms of phasing it, but really need to be linked up at the end for the building to function as a whole. And just so you know, that space is roughly 70,000 square feet, so approximately the size of the new Amazon distribution center in Weston. But I only bring that up because we've had comments about vacant spaces in the county. So however we decide to tackle that particular issue, from the facilities perspective, you'll either have vacant spaces at River Drive and Thomas Street, or you'll have the vacant space on the Lakeview campus. And ultimately, the decision is not ours, but I just want to make sure that everybody understood that one way or the other is a vacant space, and how we choose to approach one or the other is ultimately the board and this committee's decision. But that was very helpful to bring that down. So that allowed the ARPA funding allotment to decrease as well, which frees up some additional funding for you to consider how you might use it, whether that be CIP or somewhere else. We pushed off the courthouse parking lot, this east side parking lot here. We can push that off for another year if need be, or I know we wanted to talk about how we might approach the parking lot fund if we wanted to lump all parking lot projects into one thing versus what is currently more of a maintenance type fund and then an actual overhaul project. And then we also pushed off the Lakeview Professional Plaza. This one is something that will need to be done down the road, especially if we're ever going to lease out that space to other agencies to generate some revenue. But we've made several adjustments to the plumbing and other aspects of the issues we're confronting to get that building to a position where it's okay for now, but the status quo is fragile, underneath the building, but it can wait if need be. Similarly, the hydro seeder for CPZ, this is something that's a smaller amount, but it's something that could be rented out to municipalities who would be able to use it. But again, this is something that was not necessarily a have to have, but something that could be added if you decided to. The Eastgate Hall project, there were numerous aspects of that project. And on the ARPA side, we just moved forward the funding for the flooring, so approximately $140,000 there. And these are all things that could be done in phases, though the lighting and electrical and a tile, those are tied together, as are the windows and siding. So it's really sort of 3 separate projects within that facility. Then the parks projects, these I listed essentially because when we talk about these things, the questions come up about the return on investment, how we want to approach that. And absent, any clear answers on that at this point, I thought, well, we know we have some have-to-do projects for parks, and so those are the ones that remain funded. But these ones are hanging out there. Again, they could be put back in. But from your point of view, if we wanted to try to hammer out some of those details before funding them, we clearly know what the costs are. We know what needs to be done for them. If we needed to, we could adjust the campsite availability at the Dells of Eau Claire to avoid the dump station regulation piece, but that's why they're in the not funded section. And then lastly is a planning piece for the West Side Master Plan. This is something that came up as well with CPZ last year in terms of how do we approach funding plans, because they're not traditional CIP projects, but they tend to be high-value, long-term items. And so without a clear understanding of where they fall within a budget, I left it out here, and again, it can be put back in, but there may be a different approach that the county wants to take in terms of how do we approach plans for parks, CPZ, or otherwise. So the projects that were funded, I tried to split a little bit between CIP and ARPA funding. I think the main one, without getting into the rolling stock policy yet, but knowing we're talking about that soon, this is something that, again, is not by any stretch what we should do, but it's, as I thought about how could we adjust based on available funding, if you wanted to take a one-year strategy to say we can fund the status quo, if you will, through ARPA, and then if there were adjustments you wanted to make for this year, you could fund that through the available CIP balance. So this obviously means that looking ahead, this roughly $1.5 million that ARPA would fund next year would have to get accounted for, but at the same time, the CIP rollover may be higher in future years, and you also won't have big ticket items that are multi-million-dollar projects that would be competing as strongly as they are right now. So that's one approach. Again, that's just one idea as I sat here thinking through this. The highway projects I left primarily funded through CIP just because of the considerations we've had about real dollars going into the highway projects, so that there's no question about whether or not those dollars are going to get calculated the way we need them to for our GTAs. The Highway Reserve project, I know we go to reserve a lot, but this was the biggest project and the only tapping of that reserve this year, at least from the CIP perspective. I should note real quickly. Yes, sir.
We significantly spent
Kurt, if
down-
I could,
We significantly spent down the highway reserves last year, so that was one-time funding. So we don't have the amount of reserves that we had prior. Is that probably an accurate statement?
I think that's accurate. I can't remember the exact number, but I remember it being in the 20 millions. But nevertheless, I think that the Highway Reserve Fund cannot be something we keep going back to, I think, to your point. Again, this is just me trying to stretch the CIP that was available, but you're absolutely correct to say that, you know, looking at that Highway Reserve, we want to have a closer look on what's there and then what is the strategy for how to use it, because obviously it's one-time money. And I know that Jim puts a little bit back in there every year, but it's not keeping up with what we've been taking out.
Thank you.
If I can add one thing on the Highway Reserve, this is a plug for Workday. It will allow us to more promptly close out projects to make sure we have a good handle on what that Highway Reserve is. And I know that's one of the things that Christy and Mary will be working on in the very near future.
So the balance of these projects fell under, again, currently the ARPA funding column. I moved the CCITC projects over here because that frees up $858,000 in CIP rollover, which is a little less restrictive in terms of how you want to use it, or you could pay for that Highway Reserve project, or a lot of it anyway if you wanted to. So that's why they fell over here, whereas traditionally they might fall under CIP rollover more directly. Again, ARPA is going away, so this is, you know, sort of a one-time strategy. And lastly, in terms of the ARPA column, the UWSP central heating plant, we've been looking at ways we can carve that project up into different pieces. Really, there's only a way to do it over 2 years that makes any sense. That would mean $275,000 this year and then $550,000 next year. And that makes that central heating plant, which serves the entire campus, whole from that plant's perspective moving forward. That also, not in 24, but in 25, would remove two aged boilers in another part of the campus that you'd no longer need to replace, maintain, repair, or lean on for any of those services.
Chris, can I go back to your last point, because you mentioned that you moved some of that 30% set aside for CCIT into ARPA funding, but did you then adjust the KIP fund balance back?
Yes, I
Because
mean,
you had the 30% set aside, and I thought we had $2+ million.
right, and that's what it's a good point. I just added this, sorry, I neglected to include this on your sheet, so as we were sitting here contemplating it, I added it for you. So at the end of the day, when I put this CIP rollover together, absent the rolling stock question, the bottom line was 1.875 million. But when you throw that 858,000 back into the rollover, this is what you would have as the complete rollover, the 30% CCIT plus the non-CCIT portion. So just under 2.9 million. So then the balance between these two numbers is just shy of $1 million in CIP rollover that would be there if you left the CCITC projects funded by ARPA. And similarly on the ARPA side, the bottom line for that is just shy of 13 million. Christy gave me some numbers today showing there's 14.3 million left unencumbered, which is a balance of 1.386 million. Together, it's just shy of $2.4 million. It's available between the two pots to distribute to fund projects that are listed as not funded, to fund some other strategy that's been discussed, whatever the will of the committee and the body ultimately is. But again, it's back to the point of where the approach for this was to say, how can I put you into at least I would feel more comfortable position in terms of adding something back to a list and having to figure out what you really want to take away. So that's the rough update in terms of what I've been doing, trying to make this, I mean, it's a little more complicated, but it fits the available fund picture a little bit better and gives you some options in terms of what you'd like to put funding into. The number on the right here, 48 million, like the lion's share of that is wrapped up in other funds and the $11 million in forensic science center funding. So really, you've got 2.18 million of unfunded projects for '24, and then the ARPA and CIP columns to account for, and that's what you see there on the screen. And again, we have some time before the budget is finalized and presented, but the intent of bringing this to you as well, is to get guidance from you in terms of if you wanted to put some project back in or to change something here in terms of how the projects have been moved into columns, and also how do we want to handle the rolling stock funding for 2024. So that's another piece that complicated it, because if you added the rolling stock that you would traditionally fund, the stagnant levels that we've had, if you put that back over, then the amount in CIP rollover is in excess of what's available by roughly $500,000.
Okay. I'm hesitant to get into too much of a discussion of how we might change this because it's not posted as an actionable item. I think what we need to do is perhaps reflect on it and see if we have questions, and we'll put it on the agenda for the next meeting as well. But I would like to just have I'm going to open it up if I can to Jamie, to the three departments in the back row to just talk about how the rolling stock freeze has impacted them and what it's, what their thoughts are on a realistic number going forward from the Sheriff's Department, Parks, and Highway. And stay up here.
It's my understanding that our rolling stock fund hasn't changed since 2013. Meanwhile, the price of vehicles and outfitting them has increased significantly. Our average cost to purchase and outfit a car has risen to $47,000. Historically, we try to replace about 10 of our fleet a year, and we're no longer able to do that. We've got cars on the road that are nearing 190,000 miles, so safety and maintenance costs are being affected, as well as fuel mileage economy. So we're working with 2013 funds in a post-pandemic era with vehicles in poor condition.
Yeah, I will echo that as well. We have a very unique fleet with a lot of different pieces in it. So I think over the years, so one of the things I want to clarify too is on what the county sees, that the county portion of our rolling stock is half of our rolling stock. The city funds the exact same amount for us. So our complete rolling stock for us to work with is that number times 2. If we had to work with just that number, we would be really hurting. I think that for us, we have a really good priority list, and every year we look at that, and I think we've gotten to the point where we've started to gradually push vehicles and equipment more and more back because other vehicles of higher cost take more priority. We were in desperate need of a High Ranger this last year to do our forestry work and our safety measures, and that High Ranger basically takes up almost half of our budget, so one whole side of it. So we that's where we're coming across is these larger pieces of equipment are costing more and more, so then we're delaying the replacement of our regular fleet. The other part is the rolling stock policy, which I know we're going to talk about, is just the ability right now, that policy for us to wait until we have 120,000 miles or 12 years to replace our vehicles. As we're seeing with the enterprise accounts, we can find more value if we had the ability to replace them on a more frequent level. And my department has that ability with the staff that we have to do that better if we had the ability in our rolling stock policy to do that. So that might also save us dollars where we could get a smaller increase at, I should not say that, but I think if we could better manage our fleet, we could better utilize the funding that we have, or maybe a slight increase in that funding.
I'll echo both their statements with the cost of equipment. Being the old guy in the room besides a few board members here, I believe this is our 13th year we've been at $957,600 for our highway department. I'll just give you a few examples. Is our plow trucks, at this point, I have about 40 plow trucks. To replace those, I need to replace about 3 to 4 a year, depending on the year. Right now, one plow truck to replace a tandem axle plow truck is $375. So if I want to replace 4 of those, I'm at $1.5 million for 4 trucks. That's just for 4 trucks. I have 531 pieces of equipment. Granted, a plow truck has 7 pieces of equipment on it. So if I even do the math, take those off, after my plow trucks are replaced, I still have another 250-ish pieces of equipment that I haven't even replaced yet. And I can replace even my plow trucks at the $957,600. So I'm kind of dead in the water trying to replace my equipment. And as Jamie said, the equipment costs, especially the large pieces of equipment. I have a couple large pieces of equipment. I have a sweet sweeper I need to replace. That's $425,000. I have just a regular rubber tire roller that goes on the road. We're over $200,000 for a rubber tire roller. In 2 years from now, I need to replace my paver, which is our money maker that keeps us going all summer long. We're probably looking at $600,000 for one new paver. So those are some of the costs we're dealing with. And again, that number hasn't changed, I believe, 12 or 13 years. And I'll add one quick item I'm being a note to. With the equipment, the aging equipment, it just keeps our shop that much work and inability to hire mechanics. It just is a double whammy against us at that point.
So I think that's a good segue into the rolling stock policy. But what I can do for this, for the committee and whoever else wants it, I can forward this working draft as it is now with the numbers here showing the available funds. And that can help shape the discussion we have at your next meeting. But I think you understand our intention from a facilities perspective and what we did to kind of make it more of a bare bones approach. So the rolling stock policy, this was a dated policy. When I was able to track it down, I left a lot of it in place, but what we see in color is my attempt. Again, I'm not making any claim at greatness or unique thought here, but it's just my attempt to give you some ideas of how we might approach it based on generally how the county works. And so the way I augmented this particular piece is, the amount of funding will be based upon historical funding, and obviously any language can be changed, but in starting in 24, this funding will increase to meet one or all the following. Again, this is, I think, based on a year-to-year experience. So one way to look at it is to say, okay, the county's net new construction was 2.3% this year, so we should increase those, we should peg it to net new construction and then increase that by 2.3%. Now, chances are that, and I should just preface everything with this, any strategy we take here is not likely to keep up with market in certain areas, but what it will do is shrink the gap considerably, so that if you end up in a scenario where you have to get a paver that is in excess of funding that you have, you'll have pegged that funding level to a point where now you really only need a smaller amount to make that happen. The other thing we could look at, and it doesn't mean it has to be one or the other, it could be based on pieces of equipment or however we want to look at it, but you could look at market conditions, such as, look at CPI. Also just looking at it as a straight, what is the actual need? So is it a one-time, holy smokes, we really need this right now, we're going to increase the funding this one time this year to account for that. So there are other strategies I'm sure that are out there, but I just tried to hit some of the obvious ones from where I was thinking of it. The rest of the policy is the same language as it was, I think 5-6 years ago now, when the latest version. Some of these aspects were alluded to by Jamie in terms of, Like the sheriff's office replacement schedule will be 100,000 miles or 10 years. Obviously, these are kind of wrinkles within the policy that we'd want to adjust based on how we want to handle this moving forward. The changes that I've highlighted are not all the changes we'd want to look at, but they're the big ones. So again, here I highlighted contracting equipment will be on a replacement schedule only after it exceeds 10,000 hours of operation. Like, is that an accurate metric nowadays? Is that the way we want to handle it? I added a caveat here for if a piece of equipment accumulates less than 250 hours or the expected annual use. So maybe it's not accruing a lot of use, but that's expected. So then why should we handle it any differently? We could look at alternatives to owning the equipment, such as rental or leasing. The other larger part, which could really make this document much larger, would be looking at a fleet management policy. So I started looking at what other counties had out there. There's lots of different interpretations. Their fleets are all handled very differently. But what I thought of is looking, well, how does the state handle it? And so the DOA has a fleet policy that largely, when you read through it, it's 36 pages, and I'll include that in what I send to you. But really, it hits on all the things that you'd want to touch upon in a fleet policy for any entity. And there are some things in there that wouldn't apply to us too. But if rather than reinvent the wheel, if there's some basis at the state level that applies to what the state does for its own fleet, then using that as sort of the foundational document to rely upon would mean that we could adopt it as our policy, as well as any amendments and changes as it moves forward. Again, we can tweak the language or not go with that option, but again, in this language is attempting to not make this a 40-page document, which is what it would be if you copied and pasted DOAs into it. The other part here highlighted, this is from a conversation Jamie and I had earlier today, is that we've been looking at moving some departments into a fleet arrangement with Enterprise. As a part of those conversations with those departments and just in general, we've had that, can we do this on our own? And there are varying levels of comfort and experience with this sort of thing. So after looking through all the different angles for those departments, we thought it doesn't make sense for us to do it now on our own. It doesn't mean we can't do it in the future, but for the departments we've been looking at currently, we wanted to at least work with them for several years, learn the ropes, get a better feel and understanding so that you really know the high points you have to hit to make your fleet work for you. Because if you miss them, then you lose equity, you lose resale value, you lose lots of things. But from Jamie's perspective, they've been doing this management of their own fleet for long enough that their comfort level is at a point where I added the language to say, like, if the vehicles were part of the Enterprise relationship or an internal fleet run by the department, then the same sort of policies would apply. And just as any given department's transition to a fleet arrangement with Enterprise, that would need to be approved as the sheriff's office was by the administrator. The same thing would happen if a department wanted to run their fleet. You'd want to have the department demonstrate the ability to do the things you need to do. And I'm sure Jamie's crew can do it. And this came up at a previous committee discussion as well at ERC. But nevertheless, an important part to include so that when we update this policy, that we include that capability should the ability be there. Then just some additional caveats in terms of if a vehicle needs to be replaced with one that better fits the mission, because sometimes things change. One example of that would be a Forensic Science Center traditional van is not a livery service van. So if they wanted to do a livery service, they need a refrigerated van, not just this van that they use day to day now. So within the policy itself would be the capability to say, you can make that argument, bring it to the administrator, bring it to committee, we can discuss it and go from there. Similarly, monitoring fleet vehicles on a yearly basis, again at a minimum, so that we're maximizing resale value and equity within the fleet program, whether that be through Enterprise or internally. The risk management is the same as it was. I highlighted this language here. This is, I think, a historic sore point for some folks because in the event of a particular, the sheriff's office vehicle gets totaled out on the road, and then there's an insurance claim and insurance funding comes back to the county. the sheriff's office doesn't get those funds. It goes back into the general fund. So now they're down a vehicle, but they need to get one to replace that one they lost, but they now have to figure out how to do it without the insurance funding coming back from that event. So changing that to reflect that either it would go back to the department or be handled in some form or fashion that you put a department into a better position should that sort of thing happen, allows them to replace a vehicle if it's taken out of their fleet more quickly and makes them, more capable as a department, on the road or whatever they're up to. The 5-year averages, we've talked a lot about that, so I'll leave those there. I left this language at the end just for context. Again, knowing that this is just a discussion, I wanted to show you what the policy had been, which is largely what's in front of you, with some small tweaks in the larger areas that we're trying to grapple with. So I'll leave it at that for now, but again, that's my first attempt at, trying to figure out how to fill some of the gaps within the policy. And again, similar to the CIP piece, if you have guidance or comments in terms of, is it heading in the right direction? Are there things missing? Are there things you'd like to see? I can make all those changes and put that into the packet for the next meeting for a decision to be made. Whether it's the policy or the funding level, however you decided to take those on.
Kurt?
Well, first I want to thank Chris for all of your work and efforts, because I think we're moving in the right direction. One of the things that I struggle with, is when we set a level and then we never revisit it for 13 years, it puts, in some cases, us in an awkward spot that now we got to try to adjust. So I think we've got, really, as I see it, 3 issues that need to be dealt with. One is the current funding level that we have for the current year CIP rollover. But then I also, as you, I think, Chris, properly pointed out, we need to do something as far as whether it's tied to CPI, whether it's tied to net new construction. We need to understand that we can't continue to replace equipment with a number that's 13 years old. And if we're going to manage the assets of the taxpayers, and that's what we're talking about, is managing the assets of the taxpayers, manage it within a context of a CPI moving forward or something of that nature. And then lastly, I think we've looked at fleet management. The part that I struggle with is I understand wanting to provide flexibility, but if we're going to have Department X over on Enterprise and Department Y doing it internal, I think there's opportunity for challenges in that obviously the only way that you're going to actually do this effectively is have the understanding of where market values of those assets are and when the optimum value at timing is. And so I would want to ensure that we have the expertise to maintain and understand where that market is. I think one of the things that Enterprise brings to us that we currently don't have as far as that expertise as to when does vehicle XYZ, what is its optimum value for trade-in or sale or whatever that may be. So I applaud you on the efforts that we're moving forward, but I think for this committee, I think the 2 things that I clearly want to try to address is, one, the current funding level of the CIP rollover, but also looking at maintaining an index of some kind of rolling that over. So so that those are funded first out of our CIP budget.
Other questions? Ann?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this. This document was a lot easier to look at this year versus last year for me. Learning curves a little. Anyway, I do just, if I could, ask about the UWSP project, because it looks like option C has that 2-year funding. what will fund it in year 2? Is that just a guess? You're marking it and hoping, or?
No, well, what we did is, okay, option A was what UWSP put together, and it was more of a status quo project. Now, that's not to say that Gary hasn't been doing an amazing job over there. He retired, he's still coming back now a little bit, but nevertheless, they do a good job, but their lens for available funding and approach has been status quo, status quo, status quo. Now, facilities, we've been charged, county-wide and just with what the county owns with taking on more, right? So we own all the buildings on that campus, so then it made sense to say, well, we need more of a direct tie. So then we went over, did a tour of everything on the campus, and then I asked our HVAC lead to say, work with Gary on what you would want to see as the county side lead HVAC person. So then he worked with Gary. They didn't agree on everything, but the point was to say, if we need to fold that in under our automated controls, so you can get in and just see what's going on without having to go through VPN or the UWSP, their dedicated IT network. Things like this to facilitate our understanding of what's happening over there. Because historically it's been kind of, here's $57,000 and call us if something goes wrong, like really wrong. But we, especially now, and this is just an additional point of information, since Gary's retired, the Bill Gibbs is who stepped into that role. He's the athletic director over there and had worked with Gary on some things, but they've had difficulty filling Gary's position, and then they had an individual quit, so now it's Bill and one other person. So we're in communication with them a lot, and the HVAC specifically is something that their knowledge base of is not as great as ours on the county side. So again, the idea was to say, what's the alternative if we were going to do it? So then that presented an $800,000 project, right? So then there was a comment when we presented CIP, and can we split it? Can we phase it? And so then we sat down with the vendor who had put together the bid for us initially and said, how would we piece this together over 2 years? And that's what you see there. So if we did option C, the thing to understand is that you have to do year 2. You cannot do year 1 and leave year 2. But you can do 275 this year. That replaces the dual burner fuels in there to single burner fuels, which are more efficient and less expensive. It moves them away from fuel oil as a reserve. And then year 2, it replaces a Whirlpool, the really old boiler in there, and then essentially negates the need for 2 other age boilers in another part of the building, which had failed this summer. So they couldn't use them, so they had to run the plant the whole summer to do what HVAC systems do during the summer, which some people don't think you need heat, but occasionally you do to strip the moisture out of the air, things like this. So anyway, if we do option C, then like this board can't tell the next year's board what to do, but our statement would be, you did year 1, year 2 is absolutely have to do, otherwise that plant is in real danger of failure, and then you don't have heat, and then the whole campus is in a really bad spot.
If I can add one thing, underlying a lot of what Chris and Jamie, Jim, and Ryan have talked about, I'll just say the last 3 years, from my perspective, we've kind of shifted our focus a little bit. I certainly know this. I am not the person that should make the decisions with respect to highway operations or parks operations or the sheriff's office operations. We, on the facility side, have historically, if you think about it like UWSP as the tenant, because they are, and we are the landlord, our historic approach was we asked the tenants to make a lot of decisions about our assets when the smartest people in the room weren't in the room. I mean, our HVAC, our facilities people are the most knowledgeable with respect to those projects, and now we have, over the last 3 years, we've done this in a number of areas. Previously, we asked Jim's team to really manage their own facilities, not plow trucks and all the things that Jim's staff they know inside and out. We're moving into taking that on. It's the responsibility of facilities. Same thing with parks. We challenge our park staff, our parks maintainers, our parks facility people to really understand parks and parks facilities and park operations. But facilities should be in charge of when a boiler needs to be replaced. So we're fixing all those things. We appreciate your patience as we do that, but that is the logic, the concept that's underlying all the things that Chris has talked about. Let the expertise, the people with the expertise are the ones building the plans. That's why in the draft that right now is going to be folded into the budget, and unless staff make a change, it's that option C, because that affords us the most flexibility. It also allows for one thing that the full board has said, again, in my full experience on, it's limited. As Jim said, I'm not the old guy in the room. But, our relationship with UWSP Wausau has been a thing we needed to firm up and address since I started in administration 7 years ago. This gives us do what we have to do, plan to do what needs to happen next year, and have the conversations about how do we share in the return on our investment with the UW, because it's their operations that are going to benefit from this. One, they'll be able to continue to operate, but two, they're going to get the benefit of the reduction, any efficiency gains and savings, they're going to get the benefit on. So let's talk about how we be true partners in that. So I just wanted to kind of add that layer of context. That is the approach with all of these pieces. And as Chair Gibbs referenced before about, I'm always trying to look at opportunities. What's the benefit of having enterprise work with the sheriff's office and change our policy to allow for flexibility for Jamie's staff to attempt to use their expertise to manage their fleet using that same methodology? Worst case scenario, we find out enterprise is better and we let them do it. There is that delta, right? The question is whether or not all the value that enterprise confers through their expertise is greater than what they charge us for that expertise, or whether we can be good enough where the delta falls on our side. That's a question. So again, Chris's expertise on this sheet, deeper than mine. So ask your questions of him, but that's the logic that we're using all over the place. I think long-term it will pay dividends. In the short term, though, I know Mike and I have had this conversation relative to leases. We want to make sure Corp Counsel reviews all leases. All of our stuff goes through legal, because every agreement he and I pick up, we look at it, we say, wow, I wouldn't have done it that way. And we see those opportunities. So the same thing is true on operations and planning for CIP.
I'm going to direct a question to you, and it's somewhat, it goes into the budget as well as the capital plan, but as we look at North Central Healthcare and other things in terms of some of the challenges, post-pandemic challenges, I know that there's a potential ask for ARPA funds in the future, or is there a potential ask for ARPA? And if we're going down to $1.4 million, do we have enough money set aside for those? Understand we have to make the commitment by December of 2024. Are there enough funds left?
I'll answer your question. I think I'll approach it a different way. I think we're going to need to shift our expectation. North Central's presentation to the county board, I thought, was very transparent. And that's the thing I think you can count on with Gary and Jason and Vicki being very transparent, that the ask for them to service debt is going to be a challenge. They're built their budget on serving $2 million, but if certain things don't change at the state level, that is going to be a challenge. Giving us the greatest flexibility with respect to our available funding to fund our human service obligations. This is the responsibility of the county to deliver those services. That's why their budget called for increased tax levy for the first time in 10 years. I mean, it's gone down. So I don't know that there's a request for more ARPA funds, because ARPA funds, as you alluded to, that sunset on those is quickly approaching. I mean, they won't be available for you in the future. The benefit of the capital plan that's in front of you relative to North Central operations really looks at, in my mind, the A and B buildings. As Chris alluded to, we've been able to kind of take a deeper dive, credit to facilities staff and how to manage that project to get that number down. It's important to remember this affords the county board the opportunity to say, what do you want to do with Thomas Street? You already have that opportunity, but what do you want to do with River Drive? We will bring down our operational costs with that transition. And should our plan work out with the Aging Disability Resource Center of Central Wisconsin moving back to a county-owned facility, it's $150,000+ of revenue that would come in to the county for them occupying that space. So, it's a long answer to your question, Supervisor or Chair Robinson. I don't know that there's an ARPA request from North Central. They are being very transparent with the nursing home agreement we have in place that has been in place for, again, more than a decade, that calls upon Marathon County at the end of the year, we should be reconciling. The agreement calls for us to reconcile, and I did get a bill from them for 2022 for $92,000. That's the gap. We have an account in administration for other professional services that we're going to use to pay that. That's what that's for, other professional services. It's a contract. But it's important for us to make sure we have a strategy because, like everything else, human services is impacted through inflation. Nursing home operations, behavioral health, and corrections are really if you look at reports from the state, those are the three most challenging areas to operate. So being mindful of that, I think that's what, again, drove Chris and his team to present the options on the capital side that they presented thus far.
Kurt?
Yeah, if I could say one thing, as once the audit report for NCHC came through, we found out what the shortfall was. The administrator alluded to what that shortfall was. I don't know that we're going to be where NCHC is going to have a number. Obviously, their target is to be able to pay the debt service next year of $2 million. That's what they've budgeted for. So I don't know that they would ever be in a position to be able to come to the county prior to the ARPA deadline with a ARPA request for additional funding, if that makes sense.
For next year.
For next year, correct.
They could for any shortfalls in 2023.
And just as a side note, where we sit from a financial standpoint for 2023 is we're actually above on the nursing home right now.
Ann?
So just, if we could go back to rolling stock, a couple of quickies, and maybe that's for the directors. Are you sharing vehicles, and are you planning your rolling stock in departments that aren't meeting? Are there more opportunities to, I don't know if there are vehicles that you would share, but I would imagine you both plow, or everybody, there might be vehicles that could be shared. Is that being done? And then maybe this is more for the deputy administrator, future-proofing. I keep thinking about electric vehicles, but I don't know that we have any infrastructure in any of our facilities to plug in a vehicle if that were the case. So how are we dealing with the energy piece?
I can speak a little bit to the first question. We share when we can. It's very minimal, though, just because our entire fleet is out on the street pretty much every day being used. And we have people sharing vehicles within the department so that we, can try to get that down. But other things, like part of our rolling stock does include trailers and stuff like that. So if a department needs an item like that, they can use it. We have shared with Public Works of the city quite often with, like our chippers or different vehicles like that. We just recently were able to share with Highway for a piece of equipment we needed that they had, and they needed a piece of equipment that we needed, or they needed that we had, and we were able to work that out, which has been a change from the past because we hadn't been able to do that in the past. So there is a lot more cooperation. It's not a lot because our fleets utilize every day pretty much.
We have a small fleet of vehicles that we share, but generally speaking, our sworn deputies are assigned their own vehicles. I don't have hard statistics for you today, but anecdotally, we've saved in maintenance costs that way. And because of the size of the county, the added miles that would be put on having to come to the office and get cars would be significant. It also allows us to provide better service by having those vehicles spread across the county and having our special teams be able to respond directly from home instead of, for example, a deputy who lives in Colby who's on the SWAT team. If they had to drive 35 miles to pick up a car and then drive 35 miles back to respond and be driving in their personal vehicles for an emergency response, it just opens up a whole other can of worms. So our vehicles are generally assigned to an individual, and we find that they last longer, have fewer repair costs, and provide better services to the community. In regards to electric vehicles, I don't think we're in a position that we can consider those to be reliable for the length of shifts and the number of miles that they're expected to drive at this point anyway.
This is touch on Jamie's. One thing that we do have a challenge with is, a lot of times we'll use like something for brushing. When we need it, Jamie needs it. So there's a lot of crossover. So, we could borrow Jamie our plows in the summer, but you don't have a whole lot of use for those. But a lot of times, we're using them at the same time, so that becomes a challenge.
If I can add one thing for fleet where I think the opportunity is, and Chris and I have talked about this, is, relative to just general vehicle fleet, if we were able to create something, and I think moving to a consolidated campus is going to give us more opportunities for that, with now that social services is next to the health department, and if we get those other departments through that A&B project move there, the more people we have in a single spot, and we start to change the contemplation from every department has a fleet policy to we have an overarching umbrella fleet policy and a fleet. I think that's where our opportunities will lie. In fact, I had a conversation with Mike Ray, Executive Director of the ADRC, about them moving to the campus. And that's another department where they have a lot of people that utilize vehicles, a lot of times their own personal vehicles, and get reimbursed. I think that's where we'll see the opportunity on the personal vehicle reimbursement to say, rather than paying 60 plus cents a mile for everyone to do their work, what is kind of that right size of a fleet? So Chris building his knowledge through reading that wonderful 36-page document and all the work to see, what are other counties or other governments doing. I think that's where our opportunity is going to be. I have, to your point though, great question. That was one of the things when I met with Jamie and Jim a number of years ago to what are our opportunities? They certainly are limited because, like Jim said, Jamie's cutting grass and doing brushing at the same time Jim is, and they also do some pretty substantially different work relative to those things. But where there are the opportunities, I think we're trying to maximize those.
Yeah, and I'll just pile on as the newest, I think one of the newest guys in the room. There's been a discussion of sort of a public works division, but really just generally more cooperation between departments that Jamie said hasn't happened in the past. And from my perspective, that's increasing a lot and in really good ways. And so even within departments, there may be ways where we shift certain things around that would negate the need for an additional piece of equipment here because now that department can take it on. These are things we've talked about and are planning around, but haven't happened just yet. But to Lance's point, there are going to be opportunities to do more of that, and we're already doing what we can to help each other out. Even with snow removal, we had a snow summit, with parks to coordinate the effort so that we had an order of operations that made sense so that when they show up, all the snow is ready for them to move, and you don't get this juggling of snow and complicated phone calls and where are you. We're really trying to coordinate our efforts so that what needs to get done gets done in the right order and in a way that facilitates the operations of each department. So that's definitely a huge thing that we're working on, and everybody's been great. As far as electric vehicles, I know there's been a lot of discussion at the state about what even local governments can do. I can't remember where that ended up, but nevertheless, I think if there was a desire to look into that, we could certainly do that. I think, I know this topic gets wrapped up in a lot of different perspectives, but my perspective all along has always been, are there financial incentives to doing these sorts of projects, and can you generate savings? And from my point of view, there is. And so I think that as far as electric vehicle goes, it might not make as much sense in the near term to say, let's just do a standalone. But if there was the will to say, look, we can find a high-use facility like the jail. I mean, their electric bill is, $40,000 a month. If you had something that could offset that, and then even if you generated beyond that, which I don't want to get in the weeds, but with net metering, you end up getting capped in terms of what you can compensate for. You could tag an electric charging station to that to kind of take advantage of some of the additional production in a way that provides more value than the utility is going to pay you back in terms of what you're generating for the grid. So there's complementary things to that, and I think definitely some opportunities to explore. But I know that those conversations are a little complicated, and I don't want to sound snarky or anything, but it's like, again, if there's a will to say, hey, we want to look at, are there opportunities to save some funding this way, then yeah, I think that could be a part of something like that pretty easily.
Any other questions? I would just encourage you to maybe look at moving rolling stock back into the KIP fund balance, but then playing some catch up.
Just one question from Supervisor Marshall.
Go ahead.
I know that you had brought up the livery van, and my understanding is that would be billable to other counties as it is used. So in the effort to make sure that fees are appropriate, perhaps there needs to be a business case that says, here's how we would pay for it over the long term. This is the number of expected hours of use, so that we set an appropriate fee before we would go purchase a van.
That's an excellent point, Supervisor Marshall, and I'll look back at it, but I've seen a lot of different versions to date, but I think it may be accounted for in the business plan as part of the overall operational budget, so that, to answer your question, and I'll go look at the latest. I got to meet with Jess soon anyway, so I'll ask her where that's at, and then we can get you the information to show you what that looks like. I'm sorry I can't tell you off the top of my head, but it's an excellent point.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Other comments? Again, Chris, very good job. Thank you. We look forward to continuing the debate or discussion, not debate, the discussion on this issue. But I think there's a need to try to do a baseline and then increase. And that in Jamie's left, the problem with parks this year is that if we increase ours, is the city in a position to increase theirs, and so that may have to be a longer term discussion. All right. Then in terms of the reports from the standing committees, in your packet was information that was generated at the Environmental Resource Committee level, and they've had significant discussions both in terms of programmatic review, fee review, and other things. And I think they took the charge relative to reviewing the operations seriously and looked at the fees, and they wanted to make sure that information was shared with us as we prepare for the budget, and obviously administration has looked at that in the context of trying to capture the recommendations where possible and guidance in developing the budget. Were there any questions relative to the material that was in the packet? Or Jamie, I don't know if you'd like to add anything. Kurt?
Well, I want to thank the departments because I think they did do a masterful job of actually reviewing the fee structure, the opportunities for utilization of fees. CPZ, I think, did a great job of identifying where there potentially might be, a significant shortfall but the one opportunity that I haven't seen that we haven't yet addressed is how do we, so that we don't sit here 5 years from now and come back and say, well, the fees haven't been looked at again for 5 years. I think, are we going to, tie something to fees are going to increase based on a CPI or something to that nature to try to effectuate what the will of the board was?
I think that's a great question. So Mike did he and I have had some conversations just to see first of all, better understand what our past practice has been, because it's not consistent. I mean, we certainly have some fees that are reviewed, like was referenced with Parks, Rec, and Forestry and the use of the Park Commission to do that, and Jamie's been diligent in taking those things there. And there are very frequent reviews of those fees and increases for camping, for example. And we've had the Board of Health that has reviewed some of the health department fees. The medical examiner is certainly one here that we haven't brought to the full board, and there's a state statute that governs that. My sense is, in speaking with Mike, there are some approaches that I think we want to investigate. There is at least one county that essentially has an administrative document relative to fees that governs those increases. And my understanding, we have to do some more research on it, but my understanding is those are set in through the just operations process by staff. That's my sense. I need to look at that to make sure that that's accurate. I think in the future, I really, as I've said this before relative to the budget, my goal is to have an appendice of all of those fees so that when the board reviews the budget, they see what our fees are and what change has taken place from the preceding year. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get that accomplished this year, but that is my goal. It's something that I like from Brown County has that. But I think your point is well taken. It's something that, I've certainly experienced in other areas. We ask, well, I think we just did that. And then we say, well, when is the last time we did that? Turns out it was 5 to 7 years ago. So how do we keep it updated is the question. And I like the idea generally of having those things be relatively uniform in their increase. The only wrinkle that I do think we need to also have a periodic review of is our actual costs. Because, one of my big requests I have at departments, and they're doing a great job, is really trying to control our operational costs and be innovative and be efficient. And as a government, we charge fees to deliver services. We don't deliver services to generate revenue. And that's a fundamental difference. And our cost to do the work should drive what our fees are. Fully capturing what the cost is always an area of discussion. We've been talking about capital projects. Funding depreciation is something I think we certainly need to do. We need to do moving forward. But my inclination is that once we get the fee schedule as an appendice to the budget, that will help us with the regular review of those fees. And then we really need to be diligent on what fees need to go in front of the full board and what their cost increases are. Again, I'm going to use the medical examiner's office as one. They are restricted by statute that it can only go up once per year, and it's by the increase in the CPI measured December to December. So knowing what our limitations are, I think, is another piece of that. So frequent review through the kind of the budget process as an appendice, and then fully understanding what our limitations are based on statute, I think are two prerequisites before we can have too much movement on those fees.
Just one other comment. No, I fully appreciate. I think we're heading in the right direction. I've been on the board 17, 18 years, and I've been through probably 3 iterations of fee review. But to your point, yeah, we just did that. Well, yeah, we did about 5 years ago, and then we didn't have a true understanding. We don't do and to some extent, I understand. Cost accounting is not one of the things that government does a real good job of understanding what true costs are. Direct costs, easy. But when you try to figure out allocated additional costs, that's really challenging, and it's because of the nature of government business. But that's not a criticism; it's just a reality.
I would like to just highlight what the Parks Department did relative to the budget, and I think it's really helpful because they looked at the levy support analysis action steps. And I think that might be something that, as we're dealing with that policy that you had talked about, we might encourage other departments to take a similar approach to. And I think, Jamie, thank you for doing that. I think it's a great model for us. And I think that there was a lot of good that came out of this process this year. So, again, other committees have taken different approaches to the task, and we specifically had a request to share this one. Anything else on report from standing committees? All right. We will have a full meeting on the 26th with or without a budget, because we'll continue to discuss some of the components. I'd like to put the KIP back on the agenda and that rolling stock and just the update, but I know we've got a number of other issues that are backlogged. Kurt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess maybe if there is a potential recommendation, as we discussed on the CIP, you have a one-time fix. Obviously, Deputy Administrator Holman's got a pulse on what the need is, and if there's a recommendation as to a one-time fix, I appreciate the long-term potential tied to CPI or net new construction or something like that. But if you could bring at least a recommendation, what that might be, might be helpful for discussion.
Yeah. Other items?
This is Supervisor Marshall.
Go ahead, Gail.
I would like to see the net new construction percentage. What would rolling stock be now if we had added from the 2013 base? So if we added net new construction over the past 10 years, what would the rolling stock number be at that level? That would be helpful.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an item that I think you previously perhaps wanted as an agenda item, but perhaps staff can save you the need to put it on future agendas. So it relates to the funding for the ice arena study. And I know this committee had essentially taken that back from the county board to take the feedback on limiting tax levy contribution to make that study possible. After Jamie went back and went to the city of Wausau, as well as got word from the Wausau School District. Both the Wausau School District approved funding, as did the city of Wausau for some utilization of their donation fund. And after that happened, Jamie and I sat down and kind of took to heart the comments from the board at that committee meeting, and Jamie worked with her staff to really evaluate what was in that gift account. And we do budget in that gift account to use those gift funds every year. Based on our kind of evaluation of those priorities, the recommendation was to move forward and fund that with the remaining balance through that gift account. So no action necessary from this committee, which again, kudos to all the user groups for funding the requisite share, as well as on my behalf, I'll thank the city of Wausau for approving the utilization of those funds, as well as the school district. So we'll go back and make sure that the consultant includes all the feedback in terms of things to really make sure we dive into through that study, but no need for this committee or the full board to take any further action.
I do want to add that youth hockey gave 5,000 also.
All right, well, thank you. Other items for future?
Mr. Chair, I ran out to the bathroom. Jim said you had a question about the rolling stock and the city's share portion of it.
If we were to increase the county's portion, would the city be in a position to match that?
Well, that's a discussion we would have, with the finance director, but per their resolution that they signed in 1974 when they turned over, it does specifically say that they share in the cost of all equipment, facilities, and personnel. And so that has been kind of the binding document of our partnership the last 50 years. So that is something, usually when I take the rolling stock, they don't ever discuss. Marianne just really puts it in the budget and says this is what we have to fund for the county. And there hasn't, in my 5 years, almost 6 years here, there hasn't been any discussion on that. It gets to be part of the budget. So
Because it hasn't increased, just so we set the
It
expectation.
hasn't
So
increased, right.
if we were, I think it is inherent in a partnership,
Yes,
in a contract to make sure that the other party is in a position to do that. So I maybe if we could have those discussions in the context of the dollars that we've asked Chris to look into, are they in a position to, if we give a 20% increase to match that? I think we don't want to catch them off guard.
Yes, we can definitely do that. And I also will provide Chris some cost of recovery information that I put together for a couple of the CIP items that relate to parks as well. So that's more data that you have as well.
I'm just relying on my experience as a former mayor. I wouldn't want to get that at the last minute.
No, I think we need to have ample time.
Chris?
Just a quick note to say that we brought a resolution forward through public safety for the final phases, essentially, of the Forensic Science Center design and getting us to the point of hitting go. And so that should come to you as well at your next meeting.
That'll be on the agenda for that meeting and a number of other items. Anything else? If not, the next meeting will be on the 26th at 3. Do I have a motion under number 9? Moved by Supervisor Lemmer, seconded by Supervisor Hart. All those in favor of adjournment will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you for your participation.